Hello and welcome to UMBC TV. I'm Michelle Stefano. I work for Maryland Traditions, the folk life program of the Maryland State Arts Council. I'm also the folklorist in residence here in the American Studies Department at UMBC. And today we'll be talking to Mimi Dietrich, a master quilter from here in Catonsville, Maryland. Mimi was also a member of the first graduating class at UMBC, so that's really exciting. And this year Mimi is enjoying and has received a grant from Maryland Traditions to safeguard and transmit the knowledge that is associated with quilting. So I guess my first question would be, what got you into quilting? And what kinds of quilting do you do?
Okay, let's start with what got me into quilting.
Okay.
I learned to sew when I was about 13 years old, and I just loved sewing. And when I graduated from UMBC and got married and was ready to have my first child, I worked with some other women who were making quilts for their new babies. And I thought, well, if I can sew, I can make a quilt. So that's what got me into quilting. And I brought the first quilt that I made. It's this quilt,
Right.
and it's kind of fun because back then, we're talking 1974,
Yeah.
we didn't know if we were getting boys or girls. And I want to tell you, well, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I really wanted a girl and ended up with Jonathan. So this was a fun quilt to make. It was right around the bicentennial of the United States, and quilts were being shown in magazines, all kinds of magazines. And this pattern is a very traditional pattern that's been used a lot. And
Okay.
I just loved it and thought it was
it's
great
absolutely
for a baby
beautiful.
quilt. So this was the first quilt that I ever made.
That's absolutely beautiful. Let's go back a moment. We'll talk about some of the elements that are incorporated in here,
okay.
traditional ones. But what techniques are you using to make this quilt and the other quilts that we'll look at in a little bit?
Okay, there are several techniques that are used in quilting. Basically, quilts are usually either patchwork quilts, which means pieces are pieced together, or they're applique, which means pieces are sewn on top of a solid piece. And my favorite quilting technique is applique. And I think it's kind of fun because the very first quilt I made, these little people are appliqued on top of a solid block. But then when you talk about the whole quilt, the block with the applique on it is pieced into the setting strips here and the border here. So all of these are stitched together.
Okay.
Okay.
So you brought up the traditional elements that are incorporated in this quilt in particular. Could you talk a little bit about them? What do you mean traditional? Traditional to quilting in general, or Baltimore or Maryland?
Actually,
quilting.
These techniques I think are really traditional to the quilting series. When we talk about applique or we talk about patchwork.
Right.
And sometimes they're mixed, like this quilt has a little bit of both. Sometimes people just really love to do applique, which a lot of times is hand-stitched. And a lot of times people like to do patchwork, which is sewn by machine.
Right.
It's a little bit faster, goes, people get quilts made a little bit faster that way.
So what inspires you? Or what inspired you in the beginning? Or?
Okay. In 1981, there was an exhibit of quilts at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And those quilts were incredible. The quilts were known as Baltimore album quilts, which was very special to me because I grew up in Baltimore. I lived in Baltimore all my life. And to me, it was, well, Baltimore's been famous for some very wonderful sports teams, but in my world, it was like, wow, Baltimore is famous for incredible quilts. And the quilts that were known as Baltimore album quilts were basically appliqued quilts. Each block on the quilt was appliqued with something wonderful. There were lots of baskets, flowers, there were urns and vases full of flowers. There were also things that were just special about Baltimore. There were some churches that were appliqued. There were actually some ministers, some little people that were the ministers that were appliqued on the quilts. A train symbolizing the B&O Railroad. There was a ship, several ships from the harbor. And these quilts were made in the 1840s and 1850s. So it's about 150 years ago that the quilts were made. And when I saw them, I was just enthralled with them. I think partly because they were made in Baltimore, partly because I liked the colors. They were traditionally red and green. There was lots and lots of red and green, red flowers, green leaves.
Similar to this one?
So I'm going to show you one, okay? And the one thing, the reason they're called album quilts is that, like a photograph album, where the pages in the photograph, each page has a different picture, or maybe an autograph album where each page has a different autograph. In an album quilt, each block or each square is appliqued with something different. And traditionally, in Baltimore album quilts, they are wreaths, different kinds of wreaths. There's ribbons and bows. There are some square-shaped blocks, and there are vases and baskets with flowers in them, and birds sometimes.
Sure. Well, beautiful. I don't know too much about quilting, but what comes to my mind is that it's communal. Usually it's a group of women who are together, gathered around quilting and talking as well. It's a bit of a social event.
Okay.
Is that still part of the quilting tradition? Is that something you partake in, or?
Absolutely,
okay.
absolutely. Now, go back to the Baltimore album quilts.
Yeah, sure.
Very often, the antique quilts were made by groups of women, often from churches, and often they were making a presentation quilt to give to someone. There's writing on some of the quilts. At the time, India ink was perfected, and so the ladies wrote on the quilts and wrote inscriptions. Some of them are to ministers, some of them are to sea captains, and very often they would get together and each person would make a different design, and sometimes you can really tell, like, one person was really good at it and one person might not have been so good. Now, very often one person makes the quilt, but also there are guilds all over the world where quilters meet and get together, and they might work on projects together. They might do education. They would have a speaker who would tell them about a different technique or a different kind of quilt, or just what they're interested in the quilting world. There are huge conventions every fall in Houston. There is a gigantic International Quilt Festival, which is also spread to other parts of the world. It's held in other parts of the world throughout the year. So yes, quilters get together for many, many reasons. Yes.
Well,
where there's fabric, quilters get together.
Well, I really find it fascinating that there's a particular type of quilt that is unique to the Baltimore area. It reflects a sense of place, so to speak, of this part of the world. Are there others who are doing Baltimore albums?
Yes, there are. And there was actually a woman who lives in Washington, D.C., who really got the revival going. And it was related to that exhibit that I told you about earlier, seeing the quilts at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And she travels, I travel and teach, but she travels more extensively than I do. And so there are people all over the United States who are making quilts, Baltimore album quilts, or Baltimore album style quilts, because I think what happened is at the very beginning, people wanted to reproduce the quilts just as they were, and red and green, but now people have started to put their personalities into the quilt. And one that comes to mind is there is a Halloween Baltimore album quilt, and each wreath in it has Halloween items, like maybe bats or candy corn or whatever. The neatest part of that quilt is the border has little swag things on it that are traditional to Baltimore album quilts, but when you look real close, they're little bats. They're bats. I had a student who grew up in Baltimore, and she took a class from me, And every block on her quilt she related to Edgar Allan Poe, which was very fun because some of the things that she did were, very obvious, like the telltale heart had like a big drip of blood coming off. She had a beautiful heart, and then it had this drip of blood coming off of it. But she also, I told you before that people wrote on the quilts, so she used ink to draw on the quilt, and she drew Poe's house, and she drew his grave, and she there's a tradition in Baltimore in January when I think it's his birthday, someone leaves a bottle of cognac and a rose on his grave, so that of course was on the quilt. So it's very fun, very fun to see personalities come through.
It's very innovative as well.
Yes, yes.
Well,
yes.
what other kinds of quilts do you have
Let's see.
here?
I brought another one that is a Baltimore album style quilt. And this one is very, very fun for me. This is kind of a story of how things go around. Like I started by seeing quilts at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And about, I actually think it's about 5 years ago, I was a partner with a fabric company, and we went to the Baltimore Museum of Art, and they became a partner in producing fabric with designs from one of the quilts in their collection. So the designs on this quilt these are not appliqued, they are printed. And in the quilt world, we call these cheater blocks because things are just printed on there. You cut the block out, sew it in, and wow, you got a quilt, okay? I like to call them reproduction blocks because they're reproducing the designs in the quilts. And the people in the fabric company were very wonderful at trying to get the colors just perfect and to get some of the elements in the quilt just perfect, like the original quilt. So the quilt was called the Williams quilt. It's owned by the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the border, this multi-strand border with many, many flowers and leaves and things, was actually in the original quilt from the 1850s was appliqued down. This is printed on the fabric. So it's kind of fun.
Yeah, and you remind me of these ideas of like what's authentic, what isn't. Is innovation allowed? Is personality allowed to be put into your quilt?
See, I believe it is.
Right, but
there are some people that don't.
Right, that was my question. Are there factions within the quilting world that object to any sort of printing or reproduction like this?
Yes, and when we were doing this, I was a little scared. I thought, oh my God, I don't know what I'm doing, but it was a little scary. Right. But when I watched everybody work on it and when I watched them carefully try to do it right, I knew it was okay. And the other thing that I thought was wonderful was that once the fabric came out, people could buy the fabric, cut out the designs, sew them together, and there's different ways you can sew them together, and they could make a Baltimore album quilt. And it might have been somebody who never ever wanted to applique, who was scared. There are some people who are scared of applique. They call it the A word. They call it the A word. So, it was really neat to see some people be able to make a quilt.
Sure. So it becomes more accessible.
Right.
The tradition. Right.
And because I think we're recreating history here in Baltimore. That's what I really love about this. I just think it's wonderful that people who live in Baltimore who have a tradition like this can actually do it, can actually, even if they don't really want to do it authentically, they can do it. So another thing that I do in my classes, I remember the first class I taught that was a Baltimore album was at least 20 years ago. And one of my students walked up to me and she said, "You know, Mimi, I hate red and green." And inside I was thinking, what are you doing here? But the answer that came out of my mouth was perfect because I realized that she liked the quilts. She liked something about them. She didn't like the color. So what if she did the quilt in purple and pink instead of red and green? And I have had students use to me it's their personality coming out. I've had students do totally all blue, no red and green, pink and purple, They've used batik fabrics, which are very untraditional to Baltimore, but very bright colors, and they've been wonderful. They've been wonderful.
So you sound like an easy teacher, very open.
I am open. Yes, 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 yes.
Well, before
yes.
we get to the last quilt, I'll ask you more about the classes you teach. I saw on your website, mimidietrich.com, that you host quilting cruises.
Oh my gosh, I don't host them, but I've been a guest teacher on cruises.
Okay, I see. And also university courses you've been teaching?
Yes.
Even
yes.
here at UMBC?
I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, I had the opportunity in the American Studies department to teach a course on Baltimore album quilts. And it was wonderful because I had all the students actually make one of the designs, actually stitch it by hand. And I had some non-traditional students, and I had a freshman, I had 3 seniors, three of the young women were basketball players, which was wonderful because I love women's basketball too, but it was really fun to see them struggle and say, oh, this hurts my hand, I can't stitch like this, and they've been running up and down the court all day, you know. So that was a lot of fun, a lot of fun. And we had a little showing at the end. When all the quilts were finished, we hung them all out and invited people to come and look at them, and it was great fun.
Sounds like it.
Very successful. And we also brought in, because it's American Studies, we talked about the history of the time in Baltimore. We talked about the sociology of women's issues at the time, and talked about the women. We have bright lights, and we have just all kinds of things to help us stitch. And how did these people do this 150 years ago?
Oh, wow, very interesting. Yeah. So why do you teach, or why do you do this tradition? How does it make you feel?
Can't you tell I love it? I think I do it because I grew up in Baltimore. Baltimore's my home. I see it as something that is very Baltimore, and it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of Baltimore history. And I see people who have also lived in Baltimore in different parts of the city, and different parts of Maryland, who also love it and want to give it a try. And my class, I teach a class that's a year long, I teach 2 classes. One class is one block, and they finish one block, and we call it my first Baltimore block. And some people go on further, and some people are happy to have done one block. And then I teach a class that goes on for a year, and we meet once a month. Each month we make one block, so by the end of the year they have 12 blocks.
And how long does a block take to make?
You have to work on it. It takes a month.
Right, full month.
Yeah, sometimes it takes 2 months, but I don't tell them that. And then we have a big show and tell at the end where everybody shows the blocks that they've made, and some people come back with an entire quilt done, which is great. Yeah. And I think if I taught Baltimore album quilts and taught them just like the original antique quilts, I think I would have stopped a long time ago. But watching people choose different blocks and choose different colors and do different things with the blocks, it's just great to see their creativity come out. I love it.
Do you think it helps the tradition stay alive?
I do. Yeah. I do. Yeah. I think, yes. Because I think people take the tradition, change it a little bit, and make it their own.
Right. So what other one do you have under here?
Oh, we have one more quilt under here.
This looks different. What type is this?
It's a little different, but it's related. One day I woke up. I don't know how these things happen, but one day I woke up and there was a book laying on the little chest in my room, and it was called The Civil War Diary Quilt. And I thought, diary quilt. I wonder if anybody has ever written a book or made a quilt. I think they've made quilts like this. And the Baltimore album quilts in some ways are like this, where the different designs in the quilt, the different blocks in the quilt, tell the story of their life. So that is what this quilt does. There's a very interesting tradition in quilting where this may look to you like triangles, but each of these blocks has a name. Sometimes the name is given to a block in a certain area of the country. For instance, there's a pointy star block that on the coast is called Mariner's Compass because of the compass that the mariners use. But in other parts of the country, it's called chips and whetstones because it's supposed to be like, the person who cuts down the trees. It's the little angles that come off when they cut. So each one of these blocks has a meaning.
Is this your wedding?
No, this is my dad. This is my dad. My dad, when he would get dressed up to go somewhere, he would wear bow ties.
Right. That's obviously the groom in your wedding.
Yeah.
But
He made this big deal out of tying the bow tie.
Okay.
This one is for my mom, who is from Mississippi, and so this one is actually, the block is called Southern Belle, and I thought that's perfect for my mom. It's just perfect. And let's see.
So there is a book that tells you what each code, so to
I ended
speak,
up
means?
writing a book.
Oh,
the
you wrote the
codes.
book.
Yes, yes, I wrote
All right.
the book, and the book has, I think it's got about 150 little 6-inch blocks in it, and directions for putting the blocks together, and the meanings for the blocks, so that a quilter can look through it. And what I do in a class is I give everybody Post-it notes and just tell them to go through and stick a Post-it note on the blocks that they like, okay? And it might be the name of the block that they like, and it might be just the design, but something about the block very often triggers something in their life. And it's really fun to see how people put the blocks together and end up with a story about their life. So there's a couple blocks that I just want to tell you about that are very, very fun. This one over here is called Crayon Box, and it's just because of all the little sticks. It's also based on a very old pattern called a log cabin. But I can remember when I was little, whenever I got a box of crayons, especially a box of 64 crayons, to me there was nothing better in the world than that. And the little dog print paw down there is kind of fun to talk about because, first of all, we had a dog when my kids were growing up, and our dog's name was Patches, and so I had to put Patches in here. But when I was trying to find a pattern for this, I was looking for a paw print, and I had a UMBC sweatshirt that had a paw print on it. So I just took the sweatshirt, put it on the Xerox machine, Xeroxed it. There's my pattern. Okay, so there's a little UMBC connection to it.
Lovely.
So, and there's a spool of thread down there. The bottom, there's a little flag. Catonsville, where I live, has for more than 50 years had a 4th of July celebration that's incredible. So that's what the flag is all about. One fun thing, there's a lot of fun things. Can you tell I just love this quilt? I have a granddaughter she's now 7 years old, but last year I hung the quilts on the wall and I read her the story about the quilt. And I told her all the different things about the quilt, birthdays and Christmas and, going on vacations and friends and all kinds of things. And I told her that the little girl, this is Sunbonnet Sue from the first quilt I showed you earlier. Okay, that the little girl represented all the women in my life and especially her. And that the little boy, he was on that quilt too, represents all the guys in my life, like her grandfather and her daddy and her uncle and different people. And at the very end, I said to her, "So, Julia," I said, "what's your favorite part of the quilt?" She said, "I like all the girl blocks." And I thought that was terrific. So,
How long did it take you to make this?
it probably, thinking about it and drafting the patterns and actually making the quilt probably took about a year. It did.
Wow. So it's almost recording your year while doing this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But I think it's kind of fun because there's some secrets in here too. People can make a block and it could symbolize an old boyfriend or, something that happened in their life, which is fun.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to share about quilting, or any
Um,
special memories, or what are you working on now?
oh, what am I working on now?
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm working on now, I have two things that I'm working on now. One is that, and they're out of the box, which is very fun. I got a lot of cards a couple years ago when I was going through an illness, and some of the cards were fabulous. And so they're about card size. I'm now making them about 18 inches by 24 inches. And one of them in particular was a really cool card that had stars at the top. And it said, it said, all of us are in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And it was a real positive kind of thing. So I made a quilt kind of like the card, but changed it a little bit, put some Swarovski some sparkles on it and some bling and some things like that. So I have this little series going on. I'm trying to do my top 10 favorite cards. I'm doing that, and then I'm also working on another book that's based on the class that I told you about. That's my first Baltimore block, where it's one block. And the purpose of the book is very simple first steps in starting a Baltimore album quilt.
So for people like me, who's never quilted
Oh, you would love
before.
it. You would love it. You could do it. You could do it.
So how many books have you written?
This will be my 16th.
Wow.
Which is very fun. Very fun.
Yeah,
Yes.
so you must be really well known in the quilting world internationally.
I'm like a rock star, hon.
I'm sorry. I already knew that. Your website's fantastic. Everyone should go. Well, I want to thank you for this lovely interview. I hope you had a good time.
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Thank you.